Hi, this is Todd Curlis at Nova Southeastern University. In this session I will be talking about the Instructional Treatment Plan. As I've said before, this will be your blueprint showing the design of the course to be used in the course development. The Instructional Treatment Plan, or ITP, is a single large document that gives all the details of the course design and activities. It is sometimes known as the design document. This is the point in the instructional design process where you get to put your educator hat back on. However, don't let the scientist hat get too far away. You will still be needing it. For this class, we will use a very specific format for the ITP. We're using this format to make sure that all of the areas are covered. We start out with the pre-instructional activities. These are just as their name implies, activities that will happen before the actual instruction gets started. We begin with motivation. How are you going to gain and hold the attention of the learner? Here is where you will want to go back to the learner analysis. Look at your description of what you think their motivational level is. Are they ready to go on and just need a quick introduction? Or will they need an extended description of why this instruction will be valuable to them? Write down in this section exactly how you are going to motivate the students. Don't say the students will participate in an icebreaker exercise. Instead, tell exactly what that icebreaker exercise will be. You should write this entire document as if you were going to hand it to someone else to do the actual creation of the unit. The next section is objectives. Here you will not list the objectives, but instead describe how you will tell the learners what they will learn in the unit. In our textbook, for example, the objectives are shown in a bulleted list at the beginning of each chapter. In this presentation, I just told you the subject of the session verbally at the beginning with no visual. Now in this section, describe the overall media selection and student grouping for the whole unit. If the unit will be instructor-led with some videos shown to the entire class, and some breakout sessions with students working in pairs, that is the way you would describe it. If the instruction will be web-based, intended to be used alone, say it that way. You usually need only 1 or 2 sentences for this. Remember that for this class I have specified that you will use a self-paced, paper-based unit, so that is what you will put in this section for this project. If you are going to have a pretest before the beginning of the instruction, say so here and give an example or detailed description of the pretest. Also specify whether you are using the pretest to assess entry-level skills or the skills that will be taught in the unit, or both. If you're using a formal pretest, you could include it as an attachment and just refer to it here. As I said, these are pre-instructional activities. We have not yet done any actual instruction. That comes next. One of the decisions that you have made before beginning this document was how to sequence the content and whether it should be divided into clusters or chunks. Sequencing is described in the textbook. Dick, Carey, and Carey describe sequencing as part of the development of the instructional strategy. Remember that in your instructional analysis, you determined that there are some skills that must be learned before others. We called these subordinate skills. It would make sense then that these subordinate skills would have to be placed earlier in the instructional unit than those higher level skills that depend on them. So in general, the order of the skills to be taught would be from the bottom up in your instructional analysis chart and from left to right. In addition, you want to decide how much instruction should happen at one time. This is called clustering or chunking. Making the cluster too big might overwhelm a beginning student, but an instructional unit with clusters that are too small may seem too simple and choppy to the learner. You will have to decide the size of the chunks based on a combination of the learner analysis, context analysis, and instructional analysis. Okay. Now that we have determined what will be covered in each chunk, let's go back to the instructional treatment plan and see how we describe the instruction. I'll go through each of these sections and explain them. By the way, the terms cluster and chunk are used interchangeably here. They are technical terms that we use in the design and development process, but we would use different terminology for the learners, something like section or unit or module or something like that. First of all, list the objectives that will be covered in this chunk. In this case, notice that we are listing the actual objectives, not describing how we will present them as we did in the pre-instructional activities section. If it is a long list, you can just list the objective numbers if you wish. Here's another reason why we wanted to number those objectives. Now describe the content and how it will be presented. At this point, you have a choice as to how detailed to make this description. I suggest making it as detailed as possible. If you are handing this off to someone else who will be doing the development, they need to have the detail in order to create the lesson as you intended it. If you are going to do the development yourself, you will have to do the detailed work later, so you may as well do it now. In the process of describing the content presentation, it will be helpful to show examples of what the instruction will look like. Again, it's a matter of making sure that the final product will look the way you want it to. If the student groupings and the media that you will be using in this section will be different from the overall groupings or media that you described in the pre-instructional section, tell what the change is here. If there is no change, you can simply delete this heading. The next section describes how you plan to design interaction into the instruction. These are the student activities that make the difference between a presentation, like this one, and real instruction. Like all of the items here, you can either describe the activity or write out the whole thing for later pasting into the instructional unit. If the learners are practicing something, there must be some way of telling them if they are doing it right. This is where you describe how you will give them that feedback. Once again, if you are going to change the groupings or media for the activities or practice test, indicate that here. If not, leave this heading out. If any heading is not applicable, just delete it. Another component that differentiates instruction from presentation is assessment. At the end of a chunk, it's a good idea to give a practice test so the learner can determine if he or she has mastered these skills. It does not have to be a formal graded test, but there must be some way for the learner to decide if the skill has been learned and if it's okay to move on to the next section. Okay, now that the learner has mastered Cluster 1, it's time to go on to Cluster 2. You may notice that the headings for Cluster 2 and others are the same as for Cluster 1. Just repeat this process as many times as you have clusters. Remember that we decided to make your project for the EDD 8001 class very small. You may determine that it can be covered easily in a single chunk. Don't try to force your instruction into multiple chunks. Just use them if you, as the designer, feel it's necessary. Now that we have covered the content and activities, it's time to assess the learner to see if the overall skill has been mastered. Remember that we included an assessment in the table for the goal or terminal objective. This is when you will use it. A final assessment is required for this project, even if the task is a voluntary one. The assessment can be a formal test or a self-check. Whichever it is, you should describe where, when, and how the assessment will be administered. Will it be a part of the learner materials or a separate document? State whether the assessment will require an observer to grade the performance. Include an example of the test, or better yet, the actual test itself. Also include the grading rubric and any feedback that will be given. The last section of the ITP shows the follow-through activities or materials. We assume that the learner completed this unit in order to be able to do something at a later time. What will you include in the package that will help the learner retain the information and transfer the skills to the real world? Think of things like job aids and other take-home items. This has been the overview of how to make an instructional treatment plan for my EDD 8001 Instructional Design and Development class. This is Dr. Todd Curlis. Thanks for watching.